Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the Penn State Solar Law Symposium. We're excited for the program that we have for you today, presented by a number of Penn State partners. And this is what we believe to be the first symposium in Pennsylvania that's focused on shale law issues. Okay, so you can see the program that we have planned for today, where we are going to walk through various aspects of the solar law issues. Before we get into those, talk about some of the logistics. First of all, the program is being recorded. We will have a break after each session, approximately 10 minutes. And we ask that you use the question feature, the Q&A feature on Zoom. The materials for the program are all located on the website of the Center for Ag and Shale Law. And just to show you our website here, if you look, you can see across the top, we have the events section. And if you click on the main banner, you can get to the Solar Law Symposium page. And when you click on the events page, you will see a variety of information about today's program. Also on that, we do have a copy to the CLE form. And for those of you attorneys that are getting CLE, the form is available. We also will be putting the link to the form in the chat on Zoom. And so the one important thing to remember with the CLE is that we in order to verify attendance, we are providing a code word. And so we're asking that you provide this code word on the CLE form. And so here is a copy of the CLE form. And so you can see down here, we have session 1 code word. So we'll be having a code word for each of the sessions that you will enter into this form. I do want to thank the overall partners for the Ag Law Center that we work with, the National Ag Law Center, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and that support the general programming that we provide. So as we move into the first session, will focus on kind of a big picture overview of Pennsylvania's utility scale solar development. Why here, why now? Our presenters for this first session are two individuals that have been very involved in energy issues in Pennsylvania, beginning with shale development and kind of transitioning as solar development has risen in importance. Tom Murphy is the director of Penn State's Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research, and Tom has interacted with a variety of stakeholders across Pennsylvania and throughout the world on energy issues. Dan Brockett also has been involved in those shale issues and then transitioning into the solar issues in recent years. Dan works out of northwestern Pennsylvania, which has been one of the primary spots in Pennsylvania where there has been a lot of solar development. So if you would join me to give a warm Zoom welcome to Tom and Dan. And before I turn the program over to them, the code, for those of you getting CLE credits, the first CLE code word is utility scale. So we'll give you a hyphenated word to start off with. And again, enter this on your CLE form in the space for the first hour. So without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Tom and Dan to provide an overview of solar development. So thank you.
Thanks, Ross. If you want to let go of your screen. Okay, you can see my screen okay? Ross?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. So again, Tom Murphy, the director of the Penn State Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research. Our name maybe doesn't do justice to the work that we're doing at this point. as Ross indicated just a moment ago, we're really spending a lot of time in the energy transition space. So kind of at the convergence of shale energy as it's been developing here in Pennsylvania over the course of the last 10, 12 years, and now with utility scale solar, so the convergence of shale and renewables. So we're going to talk about the solar piece today. We're using a lot of the lessons that we learned in the shale story, bringing them forward to the solar piece as we're thinking about leasing and trying to understand the infrastructure development. There's some nuanced differences, there's some macro differences, but in reality, there's also a lot of similarities. So we're trying to use all that experience and expertise and bringing it to this discussion, and hence the conversation we're having today. As Ross said, over the course of this next 2 days, or the 2 days that the session goes on, we're going to cover a lot of different bases. And what I'm going to do today is kind of open that up by giving a foundation of what this actually looks like on the ground. We put together a virtual tour, which I'm going to show you here in just a moment. It's filmed in 360 degrees. So as you can see, as I moved it a little bit there, you can spin around and look at it just like you were standing there. We filmed at a couple different locations, and these are essentially snapshots filmed in 360. Now they give you a perspective of what's actually there on the ground. So again, kind of a virtual reality tour of these locations. And we actually have packaged it as a virtual reality headset or head viewer type of application. If you would like to use that, you just need to let us know. So anyway, we're going to take a look here. We're going to talk about some of the key issues that we think are pertinent to the dialogue that we're going to have over 2 days. And again, kind of set up a variety of different pieces. And I'll highlight those as we go through. But we wanted to start with the idea that with the assumption that a leasing agreement is in place, the option agreement and the leasing agreement is in place. What you're looking at on the screen then would be one of these large utility scale solar developments that's actually on the ground here in Pennsylvania. So again, lease in place, farm is leased. This is a farm about 175 acres. Company comes in and then starts to put the components on the ground. And I'm going to show that in kind of a time-stamped 4-stop journey so you can see what it looks like, again, over the course of time. So this is September 19. Again, company came in, laid out what this looks like on the ground, put a grid there, put flags in the ground, and then the poles are going to be punched in the ground. So they're not cemented in, they're actually punched in. You'll see what they look like over the course of time. So not a lot of people there at this point. Again, this is September of 19, just the very early stages as the process is starting to get going. As Ross indicated, it's we're trying to answer the why here, why now question. There's a lot of pieces or a lot of steps that go into creating that answer, and we'll talk about some of them. Many people will talk about some of them as we go forward. But one of the key pieces, and I have a couple of insert pictures, is some of the infrastructure. So you have substations that are nearby. Substations are connecting what you're seeing on the ground here with the solar development as it's being put in place through the substation and then into the larger transmission grid. So that's a key part of the consideration as well. And again, we'll talk about some of these pieces as we go forward. But we also recognize that there's some other considerations that we want to bring to the forefront, meaning number one, there's a lot of solar that's occurring. If you went back just a couple of years, and you can see in this graphic here, not so much. By 2019, it really started to take off, and we'll be answering more of the question, why is that occurring and what's driving that, what's likely to be propelling that forward based on what we're seeing going forward. About 370 plus projects, these are utility scale projects that are in the queue now at this point in time. So spread across Pennsylvania, you'll see some other graphics that illustrate that by Dan, who's going to follow me. We also want to give a view of what does this look like from an aerial perspective. So, how big are these? And when we start talking about, well, this could be upwards of 80,000 acres in Pennsylvania, what does that mean? What does that look like? What are some of the considerations? If you're a municipal attorney or you're working on putting together ordinances, or you're a consultant, elected official, a lot of different people looking at different aspects of this. But again, what does this look like on a larger basis, and what are some of the considerations that would go into that? Meaning, what about access or preventing people from accessing these sites, or farmland preservation issues, or wildlife trying to cross some of these areas? All those are considerations. We think about things like fencing, for instance, again, going back to the idea about ordinances and some of the considerations, or protecting view shed. You can see the vegetation that's around this particular site. This site is actually, I'm showing here in the insert picture, is actually out in the State College area. And the vegetation was there previous to the solar panels going in, but a new site would need to have that, or that could be part of the considerations that would be in a lease or would be in an ordinance. Again, we think about the some of the legal language that needs to be in a lease to protect those that have concerns about how this development might look. We also recognize there's other nuanced looks at that. So can you use different types of fencing, for instance? Maybe even getting down a little bit closer on that, what can we do to block the panels? So the height of the panels in this picture can make a difference. The lower they are to the ground, the better in terms of, there's less to see. Or if you look at the next picture, as I showed you, then, are they down below the fence, or will vegetation end a fence, or can you put a berm in front? All those are types of considerations. And that's just one aspect. We start talking about something like fencing. Also, we want to think about, well, what else would be a part of one of these installations? So in this case, the transformers and inverters and things of that nature inside. We think about impervious surfaces, for instance. Are they sitting on a concrete pad? In this case, they are. Do they need to be fenced with an interior fence to keep animals away from them if it's an area that's going to be involved in agrivoltaics or the grazing of animals in amongst some of these solars? All those are considerations that we want to be thinking about. So as I jump out and we go back to the larger scenario here, this is back to the same place. This is a Lightsource BP project in Franklin County. I'm not sure that I mentioned that yet. It's about 175 acres. I think I said that already. This particular site is one farm, but this is part of a three stage operation that's this Lightsource project. So it's for a total of 500 acres, and the megawatts, about 70 megawatts of production, and that's going in total to Penn State. So this is the site. This is December of 19. So just a couple of months later from the picture that I showed just a moment ago, and in relatively the same place. A little bit about the technology. You can see that the panels are in place versus a picture that I showed before. Again, as I mentioned, these are up on supports, steel supports. And the location that you're looking at here, I'm a little over 6 feet, and I can just walk under some of these panels, so get an idea about how high they are. Also tell you that these are tracking panels. So they're going to track the sun. They're single axis tracking panels. They're going to track the sun from morning through evening across the sky as the sun moves across the sky. They're monofacial panels, meaning that they're picking up the sunlight that's hitting the surface. You can have bifacial panels that pick up the surface, the top surface, as well as what might be reflected from the surface under the panels. So wet grass or snow, or if they were on a rooftop, reflection off the roof surface or something of that nature. So bifacial panels are increasing the efficiency. And talking about efficiency for a moment, most panels right now are somewhere less than 25%. So a lot of effort going into increasing that number. And obviously, if you increase the number, you can produce more power from solar, or potentially, you could reduce the amount of land surface that would be needed. And land surface could be a lot of things. It could be the top of a roof. It could be parking over a parking lot. It could be, in this case, over farmland, which is very common in Pennsylvania. I mentioned about the single axis. Just one last comment about the technology. You can also have dual axis. What that does is it's not only tracking the sun across the sky like these do, and you can see the tilt in the one there, but it also tracks it on a seasonal basis. So as the sun is further to the south or to the north, the panels can make some adjustments for that, and again, increase the efficiency. Also wanted to show, what's above ground and what's below ground. Again, as we think about the leasing side, which you're going to hear a lot more about, what's buried. So at the end of the life of the technology here, what would still be left there potentially? What's deeply buried, or what's on the surface and would be pulled down and removed during a decommissioning phase, which again, you'll hear more about. So you can see a little bit about some of that. Transformer here, see lines going underground, but you can see lines behind there that are above. So power that's produced here, most of that's going to go from the transformer down, follow the road, as you can see it here, and then eventually off. You can't quite see it in this picture, but it's going to actually go off site in the background there, and then out to the substation and to the transmission lines and to the end consumer. So again, a lot of pieces and a lot of considerations for the landowner when you're thinking about that lease, and they're trying to work through some of those steps, and hence why we're trying to make some of the illustrations here. What we find is a lot of landowners, they just don't know what they don't know relative to this type of development. So, what are all the pieces? What's inside the fence? What control do they have? What's inside the fence? Are they allowed in, or are there hazards in there? Again, there's your, some of the things that we're trying to illustrate through this type of process. But again, this was December of 19. So you can see, about what's online at that point. And by the end of several weeks after I was here, they were actually producing some power that was going into the grid. It was my understanding they weren't finished, but with 175 acres, starting back in September, you can see that the timeline of how they were able to get a considerable amount of that done. Step forward to June of 20, so a little less than a year later. Again, another perspective, and shot from a relatively the same place. You can see some of those interior roads. So, here you have gravel roads, which was the main construction road. Here we have some of those interior roads. And we want to be thinking about stormwater management, water running down some of these roads, or we want to think about impervious surface. Do we want to have more stone and gravel roads if that's considered impervious? In some townships, it may not be. Some it would be. Panels may or may not be, again, depending upon township ordinances and potentially some of the design that some of you may be involved with as attorneys and as consultants that are working in that regard. So are they revegetated on, again, some of those interior roads? We want to think about safety too. Human health, if somebody was down there mowing or down there for, repairing panels or what have you, can somebody get in there, with an ambulance or a fire truck if there was, a hazard of that nature? So those are considerations and need to be thought of when panels are placed. Also think about turning radiuses, which I'll show in another picture at the end of some of these roads. So if an ambulance got down to the end or a maintenance crew got down to the end, can they safely turn around and come back? So all those are many different types of considerations. I mentioned about agrivoltaics, and we think about the use of this farmland or the dual use of this farmland over the course of time. So as solar is being put on or installed on some of these farms, can a farmer then go back and do something with that from an agricultural standpoint? And the reality is, well, if it's in the lease, and if it's designed that way, often that is the case, and they can do that. And this particular operation, they can go in and actually run sheep, and that's what the game plan here is. So you can see that they've gone in and seeded, reseeded, and that's what their intentions are to do at this particular location. A couple more insert pictures as I'm thinking and speaking about that. What's there before the panels were installed? So in this case, it was a soybean field. It'd be difficult or more difficult to go back in, reseed that, and make it more conducive for running one of these agrivoltaics type situations. We also want to be thinking about in the lease retaining the right of first refusal by the landowner so that they can run livestock through, in this case with sheep, over the course of time, and be paid to run those sheep through as a maintenance opportunity where the energy company is paying the farmer then to go in and run those sheep through there and keep the vegetation down, whatever the vegetation might be. And we find that goats like to walk on panels, so they're definitely not acceptable. Cattle can be abrasive to the uprights, scratching their backs, and they're just big, strong animals, so that can be problematic. Horses the same. So really, so far, it's come down to sheep. Unless the panels are raised, then you get into aesthetic issues and some other issues that could be potentially problematic. So a variety of considerations that way. Let me back up. So establishing vegetation, having that in the lease agreement and making sure that people are being thoughtful about that in the lease and possibly in the ordinance with the allowance of agrivoltaics and or not. In some communities that might not be acceptable, for instance, if it was surrounded by a subdivision or series of subdivisions or something else that, livestock in that vicinity might not be the best. So a lot of considerations here, and we run webinars like this specifically on agrivoltaics. But in this case, we want to think about the vegetation for grazing, but also potentially for pollinators. You'll hear more about that from some of the industry speakers as they join us and talk about it. So in this case, running sheep through, this is a different facility. This is in central part of Pennsylvania. But again, we want to think about the vegetation species and what needs to be in the lease. Just a couple other shots, just give a little bit more perspective on that. Should it be done beforehand? Can it be done afterwards? I'm trying to show some illustrations of both. Depends on the type of panels, how high they are off the ground. Can you get machinery under them to establish? Again, there's a lot of different considerations when we think about that. And then just a perspective, maybe a bird's eye, or maybe I should say a sheep's eye view. If you were down low and looking from a sheep's perspective, down through those different panels, from a maintenance standpoint, what can get in there and what can't. So again, trying to show a little bit of perspective in that regard. And then to move on, again, back to the same site. This was actually just a few weeks ago, back to that location. And now you're looking at something, a little over a year later. What does it look like? How is it running? It's at 100% production. There's no sheep on it yet. You see the vegetation coming back. Again, when you remember, maybe what the first series or maybe the second picture in the midst of construction looked like, this gives you an idea. What does it actually look like when it's up and running? Some of the considerations, again, from the landowner's perspective, as well as potentially from local ordinance or public officials that are trying to be a part of the overall discussion, and possibly ordinance development or some of the regulatory that would be involved in this. So again, just showing some perspective in that regard. Also wanted to show a couple other sites. These are up in New York, up in the Geneva, New York area, up in the Finger Lakes. And these are two sites that are side by side, actually two companies. And the reason for showing these couple, we think about setbacks, between these two locations on one big parcel of ground, no homes that are real close to it. But that screened fence that I showed back in the beginning with some of the green in it was actually down at the other end of this, and because there actually is a road down there. So trying to block the view from the road from the public, and again, get this to blend into the background as much as possible. Now, obviously, this is in the snow belt up in New York. A green fence in the middle of the winter is not going to do that so much, but it does help certainly through the growing season. Vegetation in this side, you can see is maybe more conducive to running sheep through. So it was actually set up in the lease for the agrivoltaic moment. The one on this side over here to the left of the picture was not. So that's mowed with people coming in. It's actually a landscape firm that comes in. They're paid several $100s per acre to come in there over the course of the season and mow it multiple times and to keep the vegetation down, keep vines down from growing on the panels, things of that nature. Different types of fence here. You can see, setbacks from the panels for safety purposes, but you also have setbacks there between the two sites for a variety of reasons, safety setbacks because of township ordinance considerations, because they're two different projects, and some other things that go into that as well. As I mentioned, the shepherd actually standing there under the panels has a contract to come in and do this work, similar to what's on the other side with the landscape company, but she's doing it with sheep. So she's paid as a third party to come in to do that. And again, that's something that needs to be built into the contract to allow for that to happen. And a couple other quick stops here. This is out near the Nittany Mall. Actually, the Beaver Stadium is far in the background there. Just a couple other illustrations. This is a smaller site. And the point that 2 points that I want to make here. The topography has not changed. We often get that question when panels or a company looks at putting panels in. Are they going to come in and make a flat site and with a lot of bulldozing activity? And the answer is no. They're going to come in and work with what's there. They're going to pick sites, and you'll hear more about that from them, that will allow for their panels to be placed in accordance with the parameters that they need. So they have a protocol for that. Fencing there, showed a little insert picture on that before. But we also recognize that there's other things. So as we spin around, you can see, again, transformers. There's actually battery storage that's a part of this. So we're thinking about contracts, for instance. You want to think about things that may not be there at the moment, but might show up in the future. So allowances in some of those, in some of that lease language. And then this site actually now rolls up the hill you can see in the background there, and is doubled in site. It's about 15 acres, a little over 15 acres now in total. And there's a second battery storage unit there. So again, as I mentioned before, think about things that might not actually be there. And then last picture, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan. This is back to the Lightsource facility down in Franklin County, the 175-acre site. I mentioned about roads. I mentioned about turning radius, safety equipment coming through, ambulance, fire truck, maintenance crews that are coming in on a very routine basis, typically there throughout the week, making adjustments or maintaining something that needs to be done. There's also extra ground, as you can see, and I'm not suggesting the reason why that extra ground on the site, but as I mentioned about battery storage, we want to be thinking about technologies beyond that. So what are other types of storage possibilities that could be set up in a place like this? Could be something like green hydrogen, where the excess renewable power, in this case from solar, could be used to convert water through a no carbon type of scenario into hydrogen that can be used in a variety of other energy dependent industries, particularly heavy industry. So, that's something that's, fence parameters or allowances for that in leases could be important as well. And also want to show how this blends into the farming community, because we get a lot of questions about farmland preservation or aesthetics, people's housing concerns. So hopefully these illustrations with these pictures and a quick virtual tour like this was helpful in that regard. Okay, so I think I'm finished. We'll do some questions. I saw some have been popping up, but we're going to wait to the very end. Flipping it over to Dan at this point. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Dan, it's yours.
All right. Hey, thanks, Tom. While we have a moment while I'm getting my slide up, we did have a question directly related to that. How big was that first array you had in terms of megawatt capacity?
Dan, I'd have to break it down, but it would be somewhere in the vicinity of about 20 megawatts. It's
Okay.
We'd have to do the it's about six megawatts per or 6 acres per megawatt.
Yeah.
Now that's an average. That's not an exact. So I'd have to go back and look at the actual numbers, but that gets you pretty close. That's about 175 acres of panels.
All right. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Great job, Tom. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump right in the deep end here, talk about solar development. It doesn't matter what part of the state or the region you are from, there is plenty of sun to potentially make this economical. We are seeing a lot of sites near transmission lines, okay, and that's a key. We've got some landowners, farmers who call sometimes, say, hey, I'm interested in this. You pull it out of cost effective for now if you are not within, say, a couple miles of a transmission line with a path to get to that transmission line, I should mention. So most projects are going to fit into an existing infrastructure that we've seen proposed so far, but some do have some bigger ambitions. Now, going backwards, there's different scales of solar that we talk about here. Residential, we're looking at panels on porches and roofs, maybe some freestanding in the yard. This is behind the meter stuff. This is a residence or maybe a small business, a farm, who is actually using the power generated, the electrons generated there, okay? There's community solar. We don't quite have the legislation in place yet in Pennsylvania for this. Some surrounding states do. We might see that occur in Pennsylvania. Again, this is for local use, but it might be off-site, shared within a community or within a geographic boundary. And most of what we're going to be talking about in these 2 days is utility scale or grid scale solar. Called by a lot of different names, but all means the same thing, and that is it's sold to the grid. Now, any project that's going to sell power to the grid has to be approved by PJM Interconnect in our region. PJM stands for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. Of course, it serves a wider territory than that. A lot of folks are interested in who regulates this stuff. Not regulated by the PUC, okay? State involvement is kind of limited to erosion sedimentation plans, if there are any on that project. Tom mentioned a lot of developers are trying to use the natural topography. If they're moving X amount of dirt or X amount of disturbance there, then they're going to need a conservation district plan and approval. But let's not confuse this. Some personnel from conservation districts have heard from folks saying, hey, we want you or we don't want you to approve this plan. Theirs is not a site planning type of regulation. There's just dealing with disturbed earth, okay? So then we have this interconnection to the grid through PJM. This is a request, not a permit. So in essence, it's not very regulatory. Now, underneath all of this, there are some federal and state law, statutes, regulation on batteries, on wiring, all those codes that they have to follow, but those are not peculiar to utility scale solar development. And so we really come down to this one level of government that might have influence and regulation on utility scale solar development, and that's local government. We're going to have Professor Mohammed Badisi talk about that later. He's great on this stuff, so stay tuned, right? So why here and why now? Well, we're close to end users. Think population, think high power usage. That makes it economical to have that power supply nearby. We've seen a lot of reduced equipment costs, not just the panels, but all of the appurtenances have decreased in cost considerably, right? And then we have a lot of infrastructure in place in terms of transmission line availability, substation with capacity availability. Some of this may be due to our legacy as power generating. We export a lot of power from Pennsylvania to other states. And also, we have a legacy manufacturing history in Pennsylvania. I'm going to show you a map soon. But probably part of Northwest Pennsylvania's story is a lot of heavy manufacturing, needed a lot of power capacity. That manufacturing doesn't exist to the extent it once did. And so therefore, there's a lot of capacity there. And then lastly, and important, investor support, right? Here's that cost design. We've seen, 70% and more decline since 2010. These things have not only gotten cheaper, they've gotten better, okay? That's something that we're going to probably continue to see, but probably not at this rate. But prediction is we're going to continue to see a cost design, and we'll probably also see panels get more efficient. So here's your PJM zone map, and of course, we have all of these utility companies that are in each of these regions, just to give you an idea of where these projects might overlay. Here's all renewable energy projects proposed to be on the PJM grid. As you can see, there's quite a lot of them. You can walk from one to the next according to the size of those dots, but not really. Just pulling out solar by itself, you can see there's a lot proposed in Pennsylvania, but throughout the region as well. All right, so here's our Pennsylvania numbers. These are the number of projects in that PJM new services queue. You'll notice the legend on the left side kind of tells you what phase they're in. And the important number here is a whole lot of action, 370 total projects. It's probably gone up a few since we came out with this data. But we really only have 7 that are in operation, that are producing electrons going to the grid. So we're in we're in a busy phase in terms of proposing projects, but that big construction phase and that big production phase hasn't occurred yet. About 20% of the projects that are in that PJM queue include battery storage in their approval package there. They're asking for battery storage. That doesn't mean that some of them won't come back and amend that application at some point. So we might see a higher number than that. But right now, only about 1 out of 5. Here's their capacity in terms of megawatts. Okay. And you can see here, South Central Pennsylvania is a big player, Northwest Pennsylvania, a couple counties right in the center part of Pennsylvania. But really, you're looking at 59 out of 67 counties here that have a proposed project. So this is not discriminating based on where you're at very much. So there's a couple reasons why this might be. I mentioned Northwest Pennsylvania because of excess capacity. That South Central region might be for market purposes to serve places east and south there. That's, of course, my speculation. You'd have to ask. Estimated cost on this is about $1.13 million per megawatt. Let me put in the same qualifier that Tom put in earlier, which is, some of these projects are going to be a little cheaper. Some of them are going to be a little bit more expensive. But the estimate we're going right now with is $1.13 million per megawatt. So like most energy projects, most of the cost is an upfront cost. And you can see at 1.13 million per megawatt. No one's going to be building these on speculation, right? They're going to want some firm agreements in place, which we'll discuss here in a little bit. Our estimate, Tom mentioned at 6 acres per megawatt. Just a few months ago, I was using a little higher number. We were at 7 to 8 acres per megawatt. There are developers out there who are talking about being able to do this at 4 to 5 acres per megawatt. And it kind of depends, not just the technology you're putting in there, but also, how much you pack this in. There is something interesting to be said about size and scale, which is generally the bigger the project, the lower number of acres per megawatt. And we might anticipate that you need the same appurtenances, infrastructure, access roads, fence, and so forth, whether you have a big or small project. Now, the assumption here is that all of the acres that you see on this map are currently under contract through an option agreement. Important to note, and Brooke's going to cover this in our next session, but it's important to note that just because you're under option doesn't mean you're going to be developed. In fact, we might see only 10 to 20% of this developed, maybe less. We don't know. No one really does. It's going to require a lot of investment. It's going to require some public policy to line up, et cetera, et cetera. But with this, of course, this brings alarm to some local municipalities to think about these big numbers being lined up. Across the state, we're looking at 60 to 80,000 acres. Keep in mind our agricultural presence, farm fields, we're measuring in the millions, okay? So just a little perspective there, but still alarming to folks to look at these numbers and think, are we going to have 4,000 acres worth of panels in our community? So there's 3 market drivers of utility scale solar development. First is utilities. And the assumption is that utilities will probably bid for the cheapest projects to achieve their goals. Will there be mandates? This is something that we're going to ask some other folks later in the week to cover. But mandates, we assume, could come through the AEPS, Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards. They have been around in this state for quite a while. but those standards just ran out in the month of May. Not sure where that's going to head, but we can assume in the short term there probably won't be action, but assume that maybe over the long term, in the fall, maybe next winter, next spring, that this will be an issue that will be looked at. So if there's a mandate that utilities must generate X% of electricity through solar, then you can assume that those utilities might bid out those packages and purchase go for a power purchase agreement and look for the cheapest megawatts they can find out there. The second market driver here is companies with sustainability goals. And we've seen this pop up in the news all over the place. Of course, you got folks like Google and Apple and Microsoft and Amazon who've all stated very ambitious sustainability goals, net zero, net negative by 2030, those kind of things. So those folks may end up going after cheap megawatts, but they might assume that there's reputations at stake. So it might be additional considerations that occur with those. The third market driver here, institutions with sustainability goals. We just saw that with Penn State University and their array that Tom showed you down in Franklin County. We've just seen that with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We could see federal, state, and local sustainability goals along with NGOs. And they also may have goals other than least expensive, right? Now, this is going to change how different projects are chosen. If we're looking for, the cheapest megawatts to buy, that might influence where that's located. Pack them in tight. If there are folks out there that want to make sure that this thing looks great, they might space that out a little bit more, entertain some ideas about dual use, and really kind of change that project a little bit. So on the state side, that AEPS, again, that stands for Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards. We use in Pennsylvania something called an SREC program. That's Solar Renewable Energy Credits, okay? They are a free market instrument used by utilities and suppliers to measure their compliance, right? They could also potentially be used by corporations, institutions for the same means, right? So developers and brokers can sell these SRECs. One megawatt of energy equals one SREC on that market. In Pennsylvania, they have to be PA generated to count for compliance. And the theory here is supply and demand. Just like the stock market, if we have more demand, these prices go up, less demand, these prices go down. These SRECs have a useful life of 3 years. They have to be used in 3 years. This is today's price. Now, I compared this to the stock market, and one thing you're going to note is there aren't that many jagged lines on this over a couple years, right? So they tend to rest in place for periods of time. They do go up and down. When you consider that a megawatt of energy on the wholesale market is worth less than 36 under general circumstances, you can see that this SREC might be lucrative to a developer. Here's a comparison of some states around us that use SRECs for pricing as well. And you could see we would love to sell into that Washington, D.C. market and get $400 for our SRECs. But you see quite a variety of pricing there, from Ohio at $7, clear up to DC at $400 per megawatt. So shifting gears a little bit to what exists federally to encourage and stimulate solar development, the investment tax credit for solar. This allows a developer or a financier to deduct up to 26% of that project's cost. This is good through 2021 and 2022. This was actually renewed in December under the Trump administration. It tails out in 23 and runs out in 24, just in time for some new elections. So if you don't have enough tax liability, though, remembering how this works, you can carry this over. But the size of these projects, this investment tax credit might be a good incentive for folks who have a lot of profits that they would like to offset to finance these. So think hedge funds and others that may have billions looking at these projects, right? Most solar companies, most of the developers we're seeing, there certainly are some exceptions. They don't have a lot of profit. And so that's where we're going to see that investment vehicle come in. They may be the developer of record, but someone else is actually going to finance this and take the investment tax credit, right? So lots of leasing options and purchase options have been offered. We are estimating that 5,000 Pennsylvania landowners, about 5,000 Pennsylvania landowners have had a knock on their door, an email, a telephone call, and been offered a deal, okay? We estimate over the next 12, 18 months that we're going to see that number exceed 10,000 landowners who have been contacted, offered a deal, okay? So with that, that's going to change a lot. For the most part, these are agreements that folks are going to be unfamiliar with. Hopefully they are uncomfortable with it. They're big, long documents Brooke's going to talk about. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of proposals, a lot of lease options, some purchase options too, which is interesting, but not much development yet. So here's the development process, and we'll talk a little bit about when are we going to start to see, when might we start to see the trigger get pulled on some of these. Unlike other projects, the leasing purchase option is usually first. So that's going to come before folks approach a township or put their application in for a PJM request, all those other things. Going to get that signature on the line, right? This may happen by just identifying those parcels that are close to high voltage transmission, that are close to substations with capacity and so forth. Go get your signatures and then move on to studies, pre-permitting, and some site design. At any point in here, we may be looking at, trying to line up investors. There may be a utility auction at some point, looking at approval of these projects, which may come before anyone actually pulls the trigger and consummates that lease option or purchase option. And I mentioned again, the commitment for electron purchase. These projects likely won't get built on spec. So we're looking at power purchase agreements, which I will discuss in just a little bit of detail. And then we may not be surprised to find that a number of these projects are in fact sold, right, to a different developer. We've seen that pattern in other states. We've seen that pattern with oil and gas leasing in Pennsylvania. We might expect to see that again, right? A brief description of a power purchase agreement. And on this topic, I would like to maintain my amateur status, enthusiastic amateur on this. So please don't ask detailed question on power purchase agreements. I know what Google taught me, right? But just in general, a power purchase agreement, typically 10 to 25 years, okay? These aren't year by year, month by month type of, I'll buy your power next month. They're longer term. And it essentially says, if you build this power source, I agree to purchase your electrons, right? There may be ceilings and floors built in on that. There may be a set price built in on that. The math should be relatively easy to do if we know our upfront cost on this, and we lay this out over time and assign a time value to that stuff, right? End of that contract, presumably, usually is going to give the purchaser the ability to either extend that project or purchase the system. All right, so think of it as a long-term buyer here, locking that in and giving them the ability to extend that if they wish, right? So there's a ton of variability that could occur depending on needs and wants of the developer, the financer, the broker, the end user. These things can come in 64 different flavors, okay? Shifting gears a little bit, because this has been a big issue in Pennsylvania, and I assume quite a number of other states across the US. Prime farmland is the best land to do anything with, okay? So let's settle that debate. If you want to build a housing development, a Walmart, a highway, anything that involves land, prime farmland is the best because it's usually flatter, it usually drains well, usually you're not fighting as much rocks and roots, all of those type of things. So in this case, it's easier and cheaper to engineer and construct that. You don't have maybe some of the barriers of brownfield permitting, wetlands, E&S, those kind of things. I would point out there's been a number of discussions that have occurred at the local and state level, and we're going to have some speakers later talk about, can we use more marginal land for this? Is the best land use in communities? And I know we have some county planners and planners in general online here. The concern is balancing the needs of the individuals over the needs of good long-term planning. Those private contracts between landowners and developers that are already signed, haven't been executed yet. There may be some farm owners out there saying, hey, you're diminishing my property. Same as if we zoned to not allow residential development or anything else. So, I'm not for or against here. I'm just trying to point out some of the thorny issues we might have to deal with down the road. When we look at the economics of leasing utility scale solar versus growing crops, the margin per acre, solar wins every time, okay? But if we go beyond that margin per acre, those farms are businesses. And if they want to sustain that business, they've got a whole list of things they have to think through. Can they do this elsewhere, et cetera? I want to mention too that there are some built-in restrictions on farmland, and I'm going to let Brooke talk about this later, but we should know that a conservation easement, clean and green, and so forth are things that the state has already considered, and there are some rules in place that Brooke will talk about here in a minute. So we talked about dual use in agrivoltaics, and we would need to explore, does it make economic sense to graze sheep, to raise pollinators? Are we limiting economically the value of those solar panels if we spread them out, if we have to raise them up, if we have to make any kind of accommodations? But the last point is the one that I really want you to focus on, because it's easy to sit around tables and discuss what should be done, but it really comes down to those contracts that are in place and whether they allow things to occur. So will developers make those accommodations? And if landowners and farmers want something to happen, they better have good counsel, and they better express what they want and need out of that relationship for the future. So some site selection criteria. We have Philip Guerrero, who's going to talk about some of the physical features in a little bit, but we have some intangible costs for developers. The goodwill kind of factor of, does community support this or not? And this could be a huge expense of the political environment, all right? Do I have a clear path to develop if I'm a developer? Or do I have a long series where I have to pay professionals to attend hearings and debates and see a lot of pauses, and you know, are we going to see some lawsuits and those kind of things? In general, what we've seen in Pennsylvania, there are some communities that have seen solar projects go through township meetings and crickets chirp. There is no one objecting and so forth. But what we've also seen are, there are some neighbors who object to this. They just don't want to see it in their backyard. That also may be true of quite a number of energy projects, but we can't swipe that away with, you know, a not in my backyard thing. These are issues that generally need to be addressed. And a specific plea to those of you who practice law out there, landowners can have access to a whole lot of bad information. And it's been my experience that there's a healthy percentage of landowners presented with a contract who are very hesitant to get legal help. So I'm hoping that we can all step up our game a little bit and say legal contracts that last 25 years or more need to be looked at by legal professionals here. So lots of options, few developed. What are we waiting for? Probably the last two more than anything. Public policy to get settled, investors to line up, and someone to purchase those electrons. These things could change development in Pennsylvania, including new federal policy, state policy, you know, electric vehicles and other new demands, and that public policy. I just clipped a bunch of headlines here, but this is the new energy battleground. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. So finally, let me touch on options. I'm stepping into Brooke Dewar territory here, but let me give you just some quick numbers. He can explain some of the terms. From my layperson perspective, these options seem long, 2 to 5 years, really seeing most of them towards the latter part of that 2 to 5 year range. The price range for options are pretty light compared to the operation payments. A lot of these are coming in lump sums per acre. I'm hearing anything from $3,000 for your whole farm up to $80,000 or $90,000 for that 300 acre, again, whole farm thing. Most of these are coming at, we'll take your whole farm under option, but we need to realize the whole farm probably won't get developed in the end. Under operations, length of term of these contracts, 20 to 50 years. Most of them are coming in at 25-year contracts with a whole lot of options, their option, not the landowner, for 5 to 10 year renewals, okay? The life expectancy of these solar PV panels looks like it's 20 to 25 years. So that 25-year initial term of contract kind of makes sense. All of the offers that we have seen so far have been on a per acre basis. The variety of price range that we have seen is anywhere from $300 an acre up to a high point of $2,400 an acre. I would say most of these, most recently in the last few months, have probably averaged between $1,000 and $1,500 per acre. Okay, So that gives you some kind of range. You may be seeing things very different in your region, right? This rent escalation standard, the amount varies, et cetera, et cetera. So to wrap up here, why utility scale? Well, we're probably not going to see either corporations or governments reach their energy goals with these smaller rooftop arrays, 2 megawatts at a time. You can't put these projects where they won't bother anybody. We can alleviate some of that perhaps by selection, but we can't eliminate it. My observation, lease contracts are fairly terrible on first read from my perspective. They can be hopefully made good. And then lastly, this topic is super controversial. You know that, and we're going to all have to deal with that at some point. So I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to jump right into some questions. Tom, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I want to jump right in with a question for you here.
And,
So
and
Tom,
Dan, if I can just add, I mean, a number of the questions that were submitted kind of as you would expect in kind of an initial overview session, a lot of the questions we'll be getting to in much more detail in later sessions. So I don't want you to think that we're ignoring your questions, but we may kick those questions forward to another hour.
I appreciate that, Ross. It keeps us from answering things we don't know, right? So, hey, Tom, you mentioned solar efficiency of those panels earlier. I believe you said, maybe about 25%. Can you explain what you mean by solar efficiency of the panel?
Solar efficiency, I mean, at a high level, what we're talking about is the capacity of the panel to be able to convert the sunlight that hits it into electrons that are captured and produce electric. So right now, that's running at less than 25%. I think I mentioned that number before.
Okay.
There's some new technology out there that looks like it might be able to bump that to a much higher number, or a higher number on a percentage basis. It would look higher, but in reality, from a megawatt standpoint, it's it's incremental type increase. There's also just one last point. There's some bench experiments that are showing some promise now that could produce a transparent type of a panel. So essentially, you could stack panels on top of each other to be able to achieve some greater efficiency. So all those things can make a big difference. And Dan, I'll throw one more thing in. It was the answer to another question. Somebody had asked a question about the size of the facility in Franklin County, the one that we were showing in the pictures. And I went back and looked, and that's 18 megawatts on that particular site.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tom. We've got a question here. Does the landowner have liability concerns and need to carry special insurance coverage? The first part of that question, you bet the landowner has liability concerns, and anytime someone builds something new on your property, there's some liability to that. We're going to let Brooke get into detail, but we certainly would like landowners and their counsel to make sure that the landowner is not responsible for that liability. So if that's not written into the contract, we've got something kind of big missing, right? So Tom, if I could, this is a tricky one here. Brooke, you wanted to jump into that?
Yeah, I guess so. Just realize that in the next couple of sessions, particularly the session at 2:30 to 3:30, we'll talk in a lot more detail about that. But essentially, the way that the documents that are being used out there right now are written, the solar developer essentially is agreeing to cover through certificates of insurance and naming as an additional insured on their policies the landowner. So in other words, panel blows out into the road during some type of micro burst and a truck hits it, and that type of scenario, that's what is to be covered by having the landowner named as an additional insured under the solar developer's insurance policy. So that's a very common practice. So we'll talk about that later.
Okay. All right. Tom, this is kind of a tricky question. I don't. There's no obvious answer that pops out to me. But the question about bifacing panels, is that practical economically, and are we, in fact, maybe going to compete with our own there if we're trying to grow grass and pollinators and things like that? Is it efficient enough to make it worth negotiating over? Is it an afterthought? What say you?
Well, from a technical standpoint, I mean, there's maybe two different ways of looking at that question. I saw the question, thought about it a little bit. So there's a technical and maybe a financial question, and the financial we'll say is a legal leasing type question. When you look at it from a technical standpoint, I would suggest that any type of a panel that is placed over a reflective surface in a bifacial panel sort of format is certainly going to have more opportunity to capture more sun and be more efficient. So back to the efficiency commentary that we made earlier, that's ultimately what the companies are in business for, is to capture as much of that sunlight as is possible. So if you were installing those panels, for instance, on a rooftop, and the rooftop was light colored, so it was reflecting more sunlight back up, then obviously that would make more of an impact, and a bifacial panel would have more opportunity there. Snow cover would do the same thing, although obviously we don't live in a place where snow cover is, a permanent fixture. So that then takes you to the question about, well, could you eliminate the grass cover and put something under there that would be more reflective? In Pennsylvania, you'd have to consider things that would fall in there. So if dust and dirt and vegetation and things like that, all that would be problematic if you were to create a surface under there that was lighter colored, other than maybe a roof surface. So I think that would be my perspective from a technical standpoint. In reality, we do have some consideration going in Pennsylvania, some consideration going into on-ground type of panels that are bifacial. And the other thing that I left out of this is there are also floating panels, and then you would have reflection off of the water surface. So you really have to consider the location. To the point here, just real quick on the financial, is that something that should be or could be negotiated? It's going to come down to what the company sees as their most efficient and cost-effective way to set up this scenario on the property that they're looking at. So anything can be attempted to be negotiated, but it's still going to come down to striking a sweet spot between both partners, meaning the landowner and the company, to find out whether that would happen. We saw the same thing in gas. You would see, and we're seeing the same thing here in solar.
Okay, very good. We're just about ready to wrap up here. Someone did mention in the questions, under pending community solar, cannot sell SRECs in the state. Great point. Thanks for making it. Someone else asked if there's a model zoning ordinance to manage the balance of the land use. Stay tuned. Professor Mohammed Badisi is coming up, and he's going to address that. Not with a model zoning ordinance, rather he and his law students are looking at what already exists and developing some real common sense approaches to how local governments may respond. So with that, I think
Dan,
we're done
Dan,
with
there was
questions.
one more question that got shifted to another tab. You had mentioned that there were 7 projects, and there was in the state, and there was a question about where those projects were located.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up. Tom,
Okay.
do you know that off the top of your head?
Well, I can tell you right now, the 3 of those projects, the 3 Penn State projects, are all in Franklin County. So we're talking about 7. You have 3 of them that are part of that scenario. You also have the SEPTA project, which is also located in Franklin County. We just did a session last week for Franklin County officials, and we had quite a discussion about, why in that location and such. And there's a variety of things that go into that, that are actually the answers for that. Cost of land, siting considerations, infrastructure, off-takers, there's just a lot of things that are a part of that. You're also going to learn as we go a little deeper into these sessions about the Governor's Pulse program. and where potentially some of those projects will be, because that's really going to be a lot of utility scale capacity that's going to be put in place here over the course of the next couple of years. It's very short term in terms of that build out. That's going to be in 6 counties, and those 6 counties are all going to be in the central core of the state, we'll say, from Northumberland County down through, I think the lower one is Adams County. So essentially, again, it's that central core of the state. That's what we're seeing for most of the projects to this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom and Dan, for that presentation. I think a very helpful and instructive overview that's gonna set the stage for the 2 sessions today, as well as the 3 sessions that we have on Thursday. So right now it's 1:10. We will be taking a 10-minute break, and then we will reconvene at 1:20 for a session that's focused on the landowner perspective and specifically on leasing. So again, 10-minute break. We'll reconvene at 1:20.